Islamic, a very sizable presence in Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, and of course in North America. So we Muslims who live in the West, as we call it, or we teach or we research, we are confronted with these ideas in a positive way. My only concern is that, we don't sort of make West into one monolithic identity. Muslims are partners, and we are becoming more and more involved in these debates. We are not sitting as being on the receiving end as we used to be until a generation or two ago. That's a very positive development. We are part of the debate. Islam is a big topic. Every 7 minutes, there is a new book, new research paper, new video, new documentary on Muslims or Islam-related subject, and I don't want to go into the details for that. Intellectual details, historical details, geopolitical reasons, Muslim diaspora, and Muslims are, becoming part of this debate. So we are no more, we don't like to be objectified. So I believe there is quite a bit of Islam in the West. The way there's quite a bit of the West in the Muslim world. But these are living issues, and we can't get away from them. And I'm really happy that your university is organizing this conference, and there will be hopefully more conferences in the Muslim world, proper Muslim world, where you are in majority. And you don't leave this thing just to small clusters, groups of Muslims who live in the West. The professionalization of Muslims is a very positive development. So, many of us or our parents went to Britain or Germany or France or Scandinavia or Spain and Italy as blue-collar workers. And in most cases, our mothers were not educated. But now we are dealing with the second and third generation. And this is where professionalization of Muslim communities is a very positive development. And you see Muslim women especially in the media, in academia, they're producing literature, novels, fiction, plays, so they are visible. So we are not invisible community. So this is a very positive thing that has happened in the last generation or so. I know there are different sets of problems in Muslim diaspora, and there are different sets of problems with the Muslim world. And we Muslims living in the West are not disconnected with you, partly because of media, partly because we have got roots in the Muslim communities, whether we come from the Arab world or West Africa or Southeast Asia. So there is quite a bit of interaction, and especially in the universities and think tanks. So that's a very positive. Now, there are debates, and whether you call them post-Orientalism debate, that Islam and the West, or Islam and modernity, are poles apart. And there are not just people in the West, like Sam Huntington or Bernard Lewis and other scholars that I've discussed in one of my books, crescent between star and cross. But there are these views, long-held views, and they got re-energized due to geopolitical reasons, geopolitical factors, especially after 9/11, that Muslims, if they're not accepting modernity, in many of their groups are reluctant, or at least ambiguous. The way China, the way Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, the way Latin America, the way South Korea, Southeast Asia, and Japan have accepted modernity, Muslims are sort of lagging behind. So this is where this intellectual debate comes in. So one view is that perhaps Muslims need some kind of modernization, some kind of reformation, some kind of intellectual renaissance. So these are views. I'm not saying that I totally agree with them, but I'm just highlighting. The other view is that Muslims, at least some of them, over the years, over the centuries, have tried to revisit their heritage And this is what Professor Hashmi was talking about, that this kind of tradition, maybe in India, Egypt, Turkey, we called it Islamic modernism or Muslim modernism. So this is another view. My own feeling is that Muslims, West, we are part of a global civilization. And there, we, like oceans, we do not have borders. And we have learned from one another, we have impacted one another. If we see Muslims today in Europe, maybe this is a new arrival, but we have been there. We have been there in European debates, and we have been there in Spain, in Portugal, in Sicily. Though we romanticize that period, many Muslims romanticize, and many Muslims lament the disappearance of Muslims from Spain, Andalusia, and Sicily. But we historians look at the causes. But this presentation I prepared because I talk about the core of modernity. I mean, I know that some of us, rightly or wrongly, consider modernity to be basically westernization. It is the accompaniment of a process which we call Europeanization. And it includes colonialism, it includes all those things, since especially the time of Columbus. But modernity also includes a very strong intellectual tradition, which is called the Enlightenment. And some critics or writers about Islam in the West believe that maybe Muslims have to re-engage themselves with this whole intellectual paradigm called the Enlightenment. Maybe Muslims at some stage, on individual basis, had periods of enlightenment. When they talk about al-Biruni, they talk about al-Khwarizmi, they talk about Ibn Sina, or they talk about Ibn Rushd. But they need something massive which could transform the Muslim societies at the grassroots level, something which happened in Europe. So I am focusing on European Enlightenment, and I'm not saying that European Enlightenment had no issues. What I'm trying to suggest here by visiting great philosophers like Voltaire, Montesquieu, and 19th century Max Muller, that how this Enlightenment, European Enlightenment, had serious racial and religious issues. So this is what I'm talking about, but I may come back to the Muslim world towards the end, talking about these issues. So basically this is the outline. I already mentioned the relationship between the Enlightenment and modernity, and then relationship with the colonial period. What I'm talking about is that this is something which is not very well known, that how some of these scholars in Europe were very much, and then some of them in India, for example, were concerned about racial identity of the Europeans and aligning it with the Indians. And Indians here generally meant Hindus, and how this Aryan exceptionalism was defined in sort of contrast to Semitic religion or Semitic people, Arabs and Jews. And in that sense, Muslims generally were viewed on the Semitic side, not on the Aryan side. And then now, and this debate emerges in India and then goes on, all over the colonized world and in Europe. But more recently, there have been some good studies, which I would invite you to read. Maybe some of you have read them. Frederick Starr believes that Muslims had a renaissance during the medieval period, because we don't use the word Dark Ages anymore as historians, and Europe has offloaded that baggage. Medieval period is the age of scholarly, cultural, intellectual activities. If some Europeans didn't know about it, it is their problem. So we don't use the word Dark Ages anymore. We consider it to be a period of all kinds of activities. though the focus is on Mongols, the focus is on decline of the Muslim caliphate, though the focus is on the Crusades, but there were lots of intellectual activity. So Frederick Starr, an American historian, reminds us of a forgotten Muslim Enlightenment. It's a good book, worth reading, but then again, it takes you to the past. Maybe it will empower us when we talk about our current issues. And then Christopher Blake, who spent lots of time in Iran, he's a British journalist, he did a book which has been reviewed extensively. His thesis is that Muslims started seeing the germination of enlightenment, especially in their encounter with the Europeans in the 19th century. Because by that time, 3 or 4 major empires, the Mughals in India, Qajars in Persia, and Ottomans in the Near East were very, very weak. They were resisting modernization. They were resisting modern technology. They were even rejecting the printing press. They were rejecting, all kinds of changes, whether you call them ijtihad or synthesis or imtizaj or whatever. So his thesis is that there were some individuals in India, but mostly he focuses on Iran, Persia, on Egypt, and on Ottoman Turkey. That there were some individuals who said, look, we have been left behind. How come few hundred people from faraway places come over and take over these vast lands? My students ask me this question, and in a very reductionist way, I say knowledge capital. West had accumulated knowledge capital, the universities, the think tanks, the maps, geography, translations, debates, all those things, which again are part of European modernity, created a new Europe, created a new West, which continues to dominate even today. So knowledge capital is my simple answer, because I'm an academic. I could look at Gina, I live in Oxford, I go to Cambridge, I have been to some of the top-notch universities, and I see that is a kind of West that Muslims must think about. West is not just arms dealers, West is not just arrogant politicians, West is not just, intolerant clerics who are dishing out hatred. West is not just those racist parties. There is quite a bit of dynamism of West, humanism, cosmopolitanism, internationalism, which comes places like yours, where these debates are happening. It's not just in Islamabad or Lahore or Baghdad we are talking about these things. So these are the things that I thought I will mention. Enlightenment in the European context starts, people talk about, trace its root from the 18th century, and we historians call it long 18th century. Why? Because we think it started in the late 17th century, and it went on until the Congress of Vienna. And here were the people who impacted, the medieval historians and philosophers, especially from Spain, Ibn Rushd, Averroes, and Maimonides. And both of them were sadly mistreated by their own communities. अबारे हाशमी साहब कह रहे थे कि हज़ूर सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि वसल्लम की हदीस है, मैं तो नहीं रिजेक्ट करता कि उलमा पैगम्बरों की और जानशीन है, लेकिन इन्हीं पैगम्बरों ने हमारे कई फिलासफर्स के साथ अच्छा सलूक नहीं किया है. But anyway, this is where it started, and then Locke, Hobbes, Descartes, Spinoza, they pick it up. And this is collectively, and many more, is what we call the bricklayers of the Enlightenment. Kant is the first person, Immanuel Kant, who defined enlightenment. What did he say? Enlightenment means, quote unquote, dare to know, have courage to use your own reason. The same old question, reason and faith. So these people are saying it's reason, it's human wisdom, it's human intellect, which is the mentor, which is the real guide. आपका faith है, आपका जज्बा है, आपकी सोच है, वो ठीक है. लेकिन असल इंसान की तकदीर, उसका मुस्तकबिल जो अगर है तो वो अक्ल से है. And then Kant says enlightenment was man's release from self-inflicted tutelage. अपने ऊपर मुसल्लत की हुई जहालत और ये इंतहा पसंदी से निकलना is what he calls the Enlightenment. So wherever you go and the debate happens, you begin it with Immanuel Kant. This is a kind of consensual definition of and naturally it is anchored on the idea of progress, which was very popular. Of course, modernity / Enlightenment had these other aspects which are not positive. Colonialism, उससे पहले crusades, और फिर Reformation, Counter-Reformation में जो violence हुई in the name of religion or against minority or expulsion of Jews and Muslims from Spain. So these are not. But generally they feel that this is the rational thinking which eventually leads to industrial revolution, to urbanization, and it impacts social relationship. Modernization, part of modernity, the most impactful result is that social relationship changes. From community, you focus on individual. और आप मगरिब में जब आप कहते हैं कि इंडिविजुअल है, फ़र्द की अहमियत है, बल्कि आप बाज़ हमारे यहाँ लोग कह देते हैं कि फ़र्द की तन्हाई है, तो वो फ़र्द जो है becomes the core. Fard becomes the core. Community, society, state, they are to protect that individual freedom. And the concept of equality, individual rights, democracy, modern state system, they're all part of this package. But there have been critics. It's not just Muslims who have been skeptical of modernity. Even in the West, I mean, one of the leading intellectuals of 20th century, the German Jewish philosopher who had to migrate to New York because of, what was happening to the Jews in Europe. Hannah Arendt says that it was the loss of a world where private took over the public and mass culture became the mainstay besides auguring totalitarianism. But it also led to European exceptionalism, which I don't think has ended. When आपकी जो ये आते हैं public diplomacy वाले, USAID वाले, या British Council वाले, या French, वो आपको कहते हैं ये करें, वो करें. So it is still that part of the baggage that you have to be like us if you want to get out of the situation you are, whether it's education, it's poverty, it's economic underdevelopment, or it's ethnic conflict, or the state is not delivering. So all these issues, so somehow Europe becomes the model, and not only the model, but exceptional. So I don't want to go into it, but there are people in the West who feel that Enlightenment is a strictly European phenomenon. They trace its roots from Europe itself. They ignore any other input into it. And their leader is Francis Wien. He has done an excellent book on Karl Marx. He thinks Enlightenment is not a global phenomenon. If somebody wants to follow us, wonderful. But don't go to Spain, don't go to Africa and say, oh, the Muslims have contributed to it, or Jews. And then John Gray, a philosopher who taught at LSE, he says, no, modernity is a global phenomenon. It is no more Europe's monopoly. Osama bin Laden was a creation of modernity. Allama Khomeini was creation of modernity. So the modernity is a big debate in that sense. And in our neighborhood, Pankaj Mishra, you might have seen him on TV. He visited Pakistan a few times for your literature festival. He has been challenging it. So these things have picked up because of decolonialism. So there are several views, which I already mentioned, that Islam or Muslims lack enlightenment. So until Muslims have their enlightenment, whether it's inspired by Europe, the Muslims will be stuck in the blind alley. And there'll be lots of intra-Muslim violence, and Muslims will remain. And this argument sometimes makes sense, because if you look at the number of refugees, we Muslims, sadly, make the biggest number of refugees in the world. We are not a happy lot, I'm sorry to say. And if you look at Transparency International, I know in our countries, corruption is a big issue. So collectively, when I don't see any Muslim country in the first 20 transparent countries. I feel sad, like you. So collectively, the Europeans say that you have to bring in some kind of intellectual change. Some of them even said Muslims need their Martin Luthers, their Voltaires, their Karl Marxes, Webers. I mean, Tariq Ramadan, until early 21st century, was considered to be Martin Luther of Islam, until he went down because of all those issues. And more recently, I read about somebody else, that he is Muslims Martin Luther. So Europeans use these kind of familiar names to judge, communities like us. But my feeling is that, people like Professor Fazlur Rahman and many other scholars have been, and in our own case, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, Muhammad Iqbal, and most of all, Syed Amir Ali, Allama Yusuf Ali, and such individuals have wrestled with these ideas. Now, I just want to say a few things about India, because we are part of this greater subcontinent, and India, of course, modern nation state, but because, we're part of Indian, history and bigger civilization. And name came from Indus, so Indus is our main river, our life, life sport. So the Europeans wanted to know who these Indians were. And where do we place the Muslims of India? This whole issue of, and maybe racialization. So East India Company related scholars like William Jones and many others started suggesting that ancient Indians were the Aryans. And this was also linked with anti-Semitism in Europe. So many of these leaders of Enlightenment were very anti-Jewish. So they wanted to build up somebody else because they were obsessed with anti-Semitism, and they thought Jews were smart people, intellectual. So let's find some other smart people who could say that, look, Jews are not the only smartest people, intellectually, religiously, or whatever. So this is where the Indian or Indic studies become very important. And so some of these scholars believed, colonial scholars, they believed, some of them based in Europe, that Aryans, the ancient Indians, were the purest people. They were the lawgivers. They were the people who gave us the religion. They are the people. But later on, they were corrupted because of sati came in and, child marriages came in. But we Europeans are back to revive that India of Aryans. And this was picked up by Arya Samaj and all those movements. And now BJP is talking in those terms. But the British and the European scholars thought and believed that they were going to bring back the old glory of India to the Indians by telling Indians who their ancestors were. And this is where Max Muller and all this. And in late 19th century, even in Oxford, I have seen, as you will see, that they thought that Aryans of India and the Europeans were from the same racial group, which is not a minor thing because people like Hitler picked it up. And this pan-Aryanism became a very racialized ideology which cost millions of human lives. Montesquieu, for example, in French, writings, and one of the architects of Enlightenment, he inspired Walter's, book, and he said some very intelligent thinker think that Brahman sect is incontestably older than that of the Jews. ये Montesquieu कह रहा कि Brahmins are older sect than the Jews. They say that the Indians were always inventors and the Jews always imitators. The Indians always clever, the Jews always coarse. And they said, here another quote, the Jews did not set the stage for Christianity. Rather, it was the Aryans who bequeathed to us to a religion based on universal reason that the Jews subsequently distorted. So you could see anti-Semitism in building up this. And Sir William Jones, I don't want to spend too much time on him. He later on went back to Oxford and he taught there But he is not only known as one of the leading philologists or the founders of philology, but also one of the leading intellectuals, Orientalists, scholars who sort of subscribe to such similar ideas. And here in his college, University College in Oxford, Oxford has 38 colleges, so one of them University College, on the University Chapel, church में मैंने ये चीज़ देखी कि there is this mural on one of the walls where Sir William Jones is learning from a Hindu Brahmin and a Muslim, and this is the language. He formed a digest of Hindu and Mohammedan laws. So according to William Jones, the greatest Orientalist, the Aryans were a superior people, and they possessed a highly involved moral wisdom and a fertile imaginative genius. Today, Jones कहता है, they appear degenerate and abased. In some early age, they were splendid in arts and arms, happy in government, wise in legislation, and eminent in various knowledges. So Sanskrit, his work on Sanskrit being the mother language of Indo-European languages. And some people differed with, like William Macaulay differed with him. He's the famous historian who talked about brown Englishmen. But anyway, the next person, I'm worried about the time factor. The most influential person in the 19th century was a philosopher or a professor at Oxford of German descent, Max Muller. He is the man who translated Rig Veda. He spent his lifetime studying and researching Rig Veda. And Rig Veda is the oldest Veda. And it talks about your Sindhu. It talks about our Indus, because it was based in this area, Indus Valley. So he says the Aryans were the true ancestors of our race. This is what Max Muller is saying, picking up where William Jones left. And the Veda is the oldest book we have in which to study the first beginning of our language and of all that is embodied in language. And India is ready to rediscover itself thanks to the British. That's what was. He did not include Africans, Turanians, being Central Asians, and native Indians from this Aryan myth. To him, Islam in India meant suffering for Hindus. So this is where, all these Semitic religions become problematic. He noted, we are by nature Aryans, Indo-European, not Semitic. Our spiritual kith and kin are to be found in India, Persia, Greece, Italy, Germany, but not in Mesopotamia, in your country. So this is a kind of discussion. What I'm saying is that what you see today being discussed has got roots in those early centuries, and they are linked with this sort of colonial. This is what I found in the Indian Institute. This is where, in Oxford, the Indian civil servants, the British civil servants were trained before they were sent off to Africa, to Asia, or to India especially. And this one says, these plates say that Aryans and Englishmen both are from the same racial superior stock. So this is not just few individuals who believe in this exclusive, superiority of the Aryans vis-a-vis the Semitic people. Even in the university, the building which was built to train the ICSs, subscribe to it. So if you happen to come to Oxford, I'll take you to this building. Now there is a business school there, but you will see this written in Sanskrit. And then about Bahai Movement, many Western scholars were enthused. They said, Baha'is will get Persia out of slumber that Qachar and Muslims had brought in on that country with a splendid civilization. So ancient Persia, ancient Iran. And this is where the medieval period was viewed as the Dark Ages. So Dark Ages, not just Africa, very much part of Asia as well. Curzon also welcomed Baha'is, as did many other American and European Orientalists. In 1893, Islam was excluded from the World Assembly of Religions in Chicago. Who represented the Muslims there? The famous Lebanese novelist, Khalil Gibran. So I'm quickly going through, and this is where the French philosopher Ernest Renault comes in. And that is why Jamaluddin Afghani has debates with Renault. And Renault says, The Mussalman East defeated the West. Henceforth, the parts are changed. European genius rises with peerless grandeur. Islamism, on the contrary, is slowly decomposing. In our days, is falling with a crash. It is the appalling simplicity of the Semitic spirit cramping the human intellect, closing it against delicate thought, feeling, every rational inquiry. That is where Jamaluddin Afghani reacted and tried to take a stand against what Renault, the leading French philosopher, was saying about Muslims in the late 19th century. So I move on, and I talk about Central Asia. I talk about the flourishing of multicultural or plural traditions across the Silk Road. And these are the sort of rare archives which have been found in Western China, in Dunhuang caves, hundreds of those caves. There are these ancient things in Buddhist literature, in older Persian, in all kind of languages. And this is a Persian Hebrew prayer from Dunhuang, and the role of Central Asia, but I'll skip it, because how Central Asia tried to come back with some kind of response to these challenges, because they were confronted with similar kind of assault by the Russians, and similar kind of things were being written about Muslims of Central Asia by Russian scholars, which is a whole new field. So I'm passing through that. Khiva was a great center. Bukhara and Khiva were great center of this debate, and nobody has studied them so far. We only think about Khiva and Bukhara in reference to Sufis, in reference to Kharzam Shahi, in reference to Ibn Sina, in reference to Al-Biruni, but we don't have many studies on Russian colonization and what was being written about Muslims, non-Arab, non-Indian Muslims of Central Asia. And I move on because I don't have time. New Enlightenment, and this is where I think the colonial encounters are very important, and how, Raja Mohan Rai, he's buried in Bristol, and and there is a statue which was raised. He wrestled. So it's not just Muslims who wrestled with these ideas in the 19th century India, but even the Hindus were confronted with similar issues. And on our side, Jamaluddin Afghani, Sayyid Ahmad Khan, and Sayyid Ahmad Khan, I traced his years in London, and how he used to have debate with these other Dadiwalas, Charles Darwin and Karl Marx and Thomas Carlyle and Charles Dickens. They all used to meet in the British Library in the reading room, because Sir Syed Ahmad Khan lived only 200 yards away Sir Syed lived in this building. And he used to walk every day to the British Library, and that's how he established the university. Another gentleman who is not properly studied, I hope that your university undertakes special courses related to this field and theme, Sayyid Amir Ali, the first Muslim historian, and the first Muslim who wrote 2 wonderful books in English on Muslim history. And K.K. Aziz called him Renaissance man. So, these are the people. And then I just mentioned a few other people, Hassan al-Attar, who tried to revive this concept and this modernity and debate and all those things at Al-Azhar. And he faced sadly, lots of opposition. And I talk about Namik Kamal, Khalda Khanum, Ibrahim Senasi from Turkey, because I didn't want to sort of keep it limited. So what I'm saying is, we are well beyond the Dark Ages, the way the world was seen by Europe in reference to the medieval period. It's for us and for our universities, especially in the Muslim world, to think about these issues and to rise up to the challenge. Are we prepared for that? Are we going to just sit here and reject everything? Are we going to synthesize where we could be beneficiaries rather than being on the receiving end? Because what we are seeing today is there's not the West, which is so powerful today. It's the East, which is powerful today. Look at China, look at South Korea, look at Japan, look at some of those nations further east. So Muslims, when they talk about East and West, even East is diversified today. There is East, which is very well developed, and there is East, like ours, our regions, which are sadly somewhere lagging behind. And I think it's very important that when we have these conferences and these seminars, I mean, I'm not saying that we should dish out pessimism or negativity towards us, ourselves, or negativity towards the rest of the world. But perhaps we need to think about these challenges. And also there are opportunities. Because, as I said, 30% Muslims live in those countries where, they make a visible presence, and especially Muslim diaspora in Western Europe and North America. I think they have an intellectual responsibility to work as a bridge between you people and the rest of the world. Thank you very much for your patience.